The metallic tang of my own violent end still lingered on my tongue. In my previous life, I shattered my collarbone pulling Arthur Preston from a submerged car, rewarded only with a marriage that killed me. So, when I woke up staring at the exact same rain-slicked highway, hearing that familiar screech of tires, I didn't play the hero. I stood shivering in the freezing mud and watched my sister climb down into the ravine to claim my prize. It was the easiest trap I ever set. Rain hit my cheeks like thrown gravel. I gasped, a desperate, ugly sound that tore at my throat and stumbled backward. My boots slipped on the wet asphalt. I fell hard on my ass, the impact sending a jarring ache up my spine. I was supposed to be dead. 10 seconds ago, I was lying in a sterile hospice bed, my lungs filling with fluid, coughing up dark ribbons of blood while my husband of 6 years signed the paperwork to cut off my life support. The monitors had flatlined. I remembered the sudden, terrifying weightlessness of dying. Now, there was gravity, too much of it. I pressed my bare hands against the rough, freezing road. The grit bit into my palms. It hurt. It was real. I sucked in a breath of air, thick with the smell of ozone, wet pine needles, and something sharper, antifreeze. "Nora, get up! You're ruining your jeans, you idiot!" The voice sliced through the howling wind. I snapped my head up. Standing 3 feet away was Sienna. She wore a bright yellow raincoat that hadn't seen a drop of mud, her blonde hair plastered to her skull, her expression twisted in standard-issue annoyance. She looked exactly as she did at 21, unmarked, unburdened, alive. A horrific screech of rending metal echoed from the ravine below us. It sounded like a dying animal. My stomach heaved. I rolled onto my hands and knees and dry heaved onto the shoulder of the road, spitting stringy saliva into the dirt. The timeline slammed into me with physical force. October 14th, the Canyon Pass. We were driving back from a cheap diner. The silver sedan had just blown a tire, spun out, and vaulted over the guardrail. In the life I just left, I didn't think. I scrambled down that 70-degree incline, tearing my fingernails down to the quick-on roots and rocks. I dragged a 200-pound unconscious man out of a sinking chassis as water rushed into the cabin. I fractured my collarbone. I caught pneumonia, and Arthur Preston, heir to the Preston shipping empire, woke up in the ICU and decided he owed me his life. He paid my father's debts. He put a diamond on my finger. He moved me into a mansion that functioned exactly like a mausoleum. "Did you hear that?" Sienna shrieked, peering over the edge of the broken guardrail. "Someone drove off the edge. Call 911. I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand. My skin was ice cold, but a strange, feverish heat began to bloom in my chest. I looked at the dark, yawning drop into the ravine. Down there, Arthur was bleeding out over a steering wheel. "My phone is dead," I lied, my voice cracking. It wasn't a complete lie. In my pockets, my hands were shaking so violently I couldn't have dialed a number if I tried. Sienna groaned, fishing her phone from her pristine raincoat pocket. No signal. Of course. We're in the middle of nowhere. "Nora, go down there. See if they're alive." I slowly stood up, my knees knocked together. I looked at my sister, Sienna, who had spent the last decade of my previous life wearing my cast-off designer dresses, attending the galas I was too sick to go to, and whispering in Arthur's ear that I was losing my mind. Sienna, who cried pretty tears at my bedside while slipping my husband her hotel room key. "I can't," I whispered, injecting a pathetic tremor into my voice. I wrapped my arms around myself, hunching my shoulders. It's too steep. I'm scared, Sienna. She rolled her eyes, a gesture so profoundly normal, it made me want to laugh hysterically. You're useless. Fine. If there's a dead body down there, I'm taking a picture. She didn't know it was Arthur Preston. She just wanted the morbid thrill of a tragedy she wasn't involved in. She carefully navigated the slick mud, gripping a sturdy pine branch to lower herself down the embankment. I stood at the top, perfectly still, letting the freezing rain soak through my thin cotton jacket. I listened. I heard the splash as she hit the bottom near the creek. I heard her sharp intake of breath. "Oh my God!" Her voice floated up, thin and panicked. "He's alive! Oh my God, look at his watch! That's a Patek Philippe." Even in a crisis, Sienna had an appraiser's eye. "Pull him out!" I yelled down, my voice flat, devoid of the panic I should have felt. "The car might catch fire." It wouldn't. I knew the engine block was already flooded, but Sienna didn't know that. Driven by a sudden, frantic energy, fueled entirely by the flash of $1 million timepiece and the prospect of a wealthy victim, she waded into the freezing water. I sat down on the intact portion of the guardrail and waited. I didn't feel heroic. I didn't feel evil, either. I just felt incredibly, wonderfully tired. I watched the rain hit the puddles on the asphalt. I counted the seconds. It took her 20 minutes of grunting, slipping, and crying to drag Arthur's dead weight out of the driver's side and onto the muddy bank. By the time the distant wail of an ambulance siren finally cut through the storm, someone on the opposite ridge must have called it in. Sienna was covered in mud and Arthur's blood. She looked like a martyr. I climbed down the bank just as the paramedics arrived. I didn't touch Arthur. I didn't look at his bruised, aristocratic face. I looked at Sienna, who was weeping real tears of exhaustion, clutching his cold, limp hand. "I saved him," she choked out to the paramedic, shivering violently. "I pulled him out." "You did good, sweetheart," the medic said, wrapping a foil blanket around her shoulders. I stayed in the background, a shadow in the rain. "You did good, Sienna," I thought, the metallic taste of adrenaline finally fading from my mouth. "You just saved the devil. Now, you get to keep him." The waiting room of Street. Jude's memorial smelled heavily of industrial floor cleaner and stale coffee. It was a scent that instantly made the back of my neck prickle. I had spent countless hours in hospitals. I hated the hum of the fluorescent lights. I hated the stiff plastic chairs that dug into my tailbone. Sienna was wrapped in a thick hospital blanket, sitting directly under a heating vent. The nurses had given her scrubs to change into, but she had strategically refused to wash her face. A streak of dried mud and a smear of Arthur's blood remained on her left cheek. It was a masterpiece of staging. She looked fragile, traumatized, and undeniably heroic. I sat 3 chairs away, sipping a cup of lukewarm water. My own clothes were damp, but I hadn't rolled in the ravine, so I just looked mildly inconvenienced. "Do you think he'll wake up?" Sienna whispered, picking nervously at her thumbnail. Her eyes kept darting to the double doors of the ICU. The paramedic said he was stable. "He'll wake up," I said quietly. I knew the exact medical chart. Concussion, 3 fractured ribs, a hairline fracture in his left femur. Nothing permanent. The real damage was the paranoia the crash would instill in him. The heavy double doors swung open, hitting the rubber stoppers with a dull thud. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Beatrice Preston walked in. She was a woman constructed entirely of sharp angles and cold cash. Her charcoal trench coat was perfectly tailored, untouched by the storm outside. Her heels clicked against the linoleum with rhythmic, predatory precision. Behind her walked two men in dark suits, Arthur's security, and a pale, sweaty lawyer holding a briefcase. In my first life, when she walked into this room, she looked at my muddy, shivering form with absolute disgust. She had handed me a check for $50,000 and told me to sign a non-disclosure agreement. When Arthur refused and insisted on courting me, she made it her personal mission to systematically dismantle my sanity over 6 years. She monitored my calls, she fired my doctors, she slowly poisoned my food with heavy metals to induce the illness that put me in the hospice. Now, her pale, calculating eyes swept over me and immediately dismissed me. They locked onto Sienna. "You," Beatrice said, her voice a low, raspy purr. "Are you the girl who pulled my son from the water?" Sienna stood up, letting the hospital blanket slip just enough to bare one shoulder. She looked up at Beatrice with wide, watery eyes. Yes, ma'am. I'm Sienna. I am Beatrice Preston." She didn't offer her hand. She merely studied Sienna like a thoroughbred horse at an auction. "The doctors informed me that had you not pulled him from the sinking cabin, he would have drowned within 3 minutes. You saved his life." "I couldn't just leave him," Sienna breathed, her voice trembling perfectly. "I didn't even think. I just climbed down." I took another sip of my water to hide my smirk. It was a flawless performance. If I hadn't watched her complain about her shoes for 5 minutes before noticing the watch, I would have believed her. "My family honors its debts," Beatrice said, gesturing vaguely to the lawyer. "You will be compensated for your trauma and your ruined clothing. We insist on covering any medical evaluations you might need." "Oh no," Sienna said quickly, stepping back. She had watched enough soap operas to know the script. "I don't want your money, Mrs. Preston. I just want to know he's okay. That's all the reward I need." Beatrice's eyes narrowed a fraction of an inch. A tiny, almost imperceptible shift. It was the look she gave when she encountered a puzzle. In my past life, I took the check because I was desperate to pay rent, which branded me a gold digger from day one. Sienna's feigned altruism had just thrown a wrench into Beatrice's cynical worldview. "Noble," Beatrice murmured, though the word sounded like a mild insult. "Arthur is regaining consciousness. He is asked to see the person who saved him." Sienna's breath hitched. She shot me a rapid, triumphant glance, a split-second dropping of the mask, before turning back to Beatrice with absolute reverence. "Can I? Briefly?" Beatrice turned and led the way. Sienna followed, practically floating despite the oversized scrubs. I stayed in my plastic chair. I didn't need to see Arthur. I knew exactly how he looked. The bandages wrapping his head, the dark bruises blooming under his eyes, the heavy cast on his leg. I knew the hoarse, desperate way he would whisper, "Thank you." I knew the intense, suffocating obsession that would immediately take root in his traumatized brain. Arthur didn't just love things. He consumed them. He needed a savior because his own family was trying to kill him. My phone buzzed in my damp pocket. I pulled it out. The screen was cracked, a spider web of glass over the brightly colored app icons of 2016. It was a text from our father. "Where are you two? Dinner is cold." I typed back slowly, my thumbs clumsy on the small keyboard. "Hospital? Sienna saved a billionaire from a car crash. We'll be late." I hit send, leaning my head back against the cold cinder block wall. I closed my eyes, listening to the muffled sounds of the hospital, the squeak of rubber soles, the distant chime of an elevator, for the first time in 6 years. There was no sharp pain in my lungs when I inhaled. There was no metallic taste of poison on my tongue. Step 1 was complete. The leash had been handed over. Now, I just had to make sure I wasn't in the blast radius when it snapped. The ride home was suffocating. We were in the back of a black SUV, one of the Preston fleet, offered by Beatrice as a courtesy. The leather seats smelled like new car spray and superiority. Sienna hadn't stopped talking for 40 minutes. And then he squeezed my hand, she was saying, staring at her reflection in the tinted window. She had scrubbed the mud off, but left a faint smudge near her jawline, presumably for our parents. He looked right at me, Nora. His eyes are so blue, like crazy blue, and he said he owes me his world. That's nice, I murmured, staring blankly at the passing streetlights. They blurred into streaks of yellow in the rain. Nice? It's a fairy tale. She turned to me, her expression hardening, dropping the sweet act since we were alone with a heavy glass partition separating us from the driver. Don't act jealous. You had the chance to go down there. You chickened out. I'm terrified of the dark, I lied smoothly. You were much braver than me, Sienna. Truly. My total capitulation seemed to unsettle her for a second, but her ego quickly swallowed it whole. Well, some people are just built for pressure. She lovingly stroked the heavy, embossed business card resting in her lap. It belonged to Arthur's private secretary. A direct line. When the SUV pulled up to our peeling, single-story house in the suburbs, the contrast was almost comical. The headlights illuminated the overgrown rhododendron bushes and the cracked concrete of the driveway. Before the engine even cut off, the front door flew open. Our father, Richard, stood on the porch, a cigarette hanging from his lips. He had clearly Googled the name I texted him. He practically vibrated with nervous greed. Sienna hopped out, playing the exhausted survivor again. Dad, she whimpered, letting him catch her in a hug. My brave girl, Richard said loudly, eyeing the expensive SUV idling in the driveway. My God, look at you. Come inside. Your mother is making tea. I slipped out the other side, closing the heavy door quietly. No one looked at me. I walked up the steps, bypassing the dramatic reunion in the living room, and went straight down the narrow hallway to my bedroom. I pushed the door open and hit the light switch. A wave of nostalgia, sharp and painful, hit me in the chest. My old room, the faded band posters on the walls, the sagging mattress, the water stain on the ceiling that looked vaguely like a skull. It was a dump, but it was mine. It hadn't been packed into boxes yet. It hadn't been replaced by a sprawling suite in the Preston estate, where the windows didn't open more than 2 inches. I locked the door behind me. I stripped off my damp clothes, tossing them into a pile on the floor, and pulled on an oversized, faded, gray sweatshirt and soft sweatpants. I sat on the edge of the bed and buried my face in my hands. The adrenaline was crashing, leaving a cold, hollow ache in its wake. I survived. I was 19. I had my whole life back, but I couldn't just run. If I disappeared, Arthur's obsession might eventually shift back to the scene of the crime, to the other sister who was there. I needed Sienna to marry him. I needed her to completely eclipse me in his mind. I reached under my bed and pulled out a cheap spiral notebook. I grabbed a pen from my desk and started writing. The Preston family wasn't just old money. They were toxic waste covered in gold leaf. In my past life, it took me 3 years to realize Arthur's crash wasn't an accident. His older brother, Colin, had paid a mechanic to tamper with the brake lines and the steering column. Colin wanted sole control of the shipping company, When Arthur figured it out, he didn't go to the police. The Prestons handled things internally. 2 months after Arthur discovered the truth, Colin's private helicopter crashed in the mountains. No survivors. Beatrice knew Arthur ordered the hit. It was why she hated me. She viewed me as a weakness that made Arthur reckless. Sienna thought she was stepping into a romance novel. She didn't realize she had just painted a target on her back. Arthur's enemies would see her as leverage. Beatrice would see her as a parasite. Arthur would see her as a possession that needed to be locked in a vault to be kept safe. I drew a line down the middle of the notebook page. On one side, I wrote Sienna's timeline. On the other, my escape route. A knock rattled my door. "Nora!" My mother's shrill voice bled through the cheap wood. "Come out here. Sienna is telling us what happened at the hospital. We're ordering pizza to celebrate." Celebrate. My stomach twisted. They were celebrating a death sentence. "I have a headache, Mom," I called back, making my voice sound appropriately whiny. "I'm going to sleep." "Suit yourself," she muttered, her footsteps retreating down the hall. Always so dramatic. I let out a slow, shaking breath. I looked down at the notebook. I needed money. I needed a degree. I needed to become so utterly unremarkable and independent that when the Preston Empire eventually caught fire, not a single spark would land on me. I closed the notebook and slid it under the mattress. I turned off the lamp and lay back in the dark, listening to the muffled sounds of laughter coming from the living room. "Laugh while you can, Sienna," I thought, staring up at the skull-shaped water stain. The honeymoon phase is going to be a killer. The deliveries started on a Tuesday. I was sitting at the chipped Formica kitchen table, nursing a mug of cheap, instant coffee that tasted like burnt plastic, when the doorbell chimed. Then it chimed again. By the time I shuffled to the window, a massive white delivery van was idling in our cracked driveway. 2 men in matching gray uniforms carried in the flowers. They weren't just bouquets. They were massive, structural arrangements of white orchids and pale, bruised-looking roses. Within 10 minutes, our cramped, stale-smelling living room looked like the antechamber of a high-end funeral home. The cloying, heavy scent of dying petals and damp floral foam sucked the oxygen out of the air. "Oh my God," Sienna breathed, standing in the center of the room in her silk pajamas. She touched a velvety orchid petal, her eyes wide, drinking in the sheer excess of it all. "There are no cards, just this." "It's him," our mother whispered reverently from the hallway, clutching the lapels of her worn bathrobe as if she were standing in front of a king. "Arthur Preston. He's courting you, Sienna." I took a slow sip of my terrible coffee. The heat burned my tongue, grounding me. In my previous life, those flowers had come for me. I remembered sneezing uncontrollably because I was allergic to lilies, a detail Arthur hadn't bothered to learn, and I had been too intimidated to mention. I remembered him standing in this exact room, his tailored suit making our worn-out sofa look like garbage, telling me he was taking me to Paris for the weekend. I hadn't had a passport. He had procured one in 24 hours. Back then, I thought it was magic. Now, I knew it was a demonstration of terrifying, unchecked power. Over the next 3 weeks, the gifts escalated. It started with clothes. Garment bags from designers whose names my parents couldn't pronounce arrived daily. Sienna threw away her entire closet. I watched her pack her old sweaters into trash bags, her face flushed with a manic, giddy energy. Then came the jewelry, a diamond tennis bracelet that felt as heavy as a shackle, a pair of emerald earrings. Then came the rules. They were subtle at first, disguised as extreme, swooning romance. It happened on a Friday evening. Sienna was upstairs, getting ready for her third date with Arthur. She came down, wearing a stunning, backless red dress she'd bought herself before the crash. She looked vibrant, alive. The black town car was already waiting outside. Arthur didn't come to the door anymore. He summoned. When Sienna opened the front door, a tall, thick-necked man in a dark suit stood on the porch. It was Davis, Arthur's head of security. I knew the man's flat, dead eyes intimately. In my past life, Davis was the one who locked my bedroom door from the outside when Arthur decided I was too emotionally fragile to leave the house. "Miss," Davis said, his voice like grinding stones. "Mr. Preston sent a different garment for this evening. He feels the red attracts the wrong kind of attention." He handed her a black garment bag. Sienna blinked, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second. She looked down at her red dress. I held my breath, standing in the shadow of the kitchen doorway. "Fight it," a tiny, treasonous part of me whispered. "Tell him to go to hell, Sienna." Instead, Sienna's face smoothed into an expression of flattered compliance. "Oh, well, if he prefers it. He is so protective." She ran upstairs and came down 10 minutes later, wearing a high-necked, long-sleeved navy gown that aged her 10 years. It swallowed her light. It made her look exactly like a Preston. She walked out the door, and the heavy thud of the town car closing echoed through the quiet street. I turned back to the sink, turning on the cold water to wash my mug. My hands were shaking. The water was freezing, numbing my fingers, but I couldn't stop shivering. It was happening exactly the same way. The systematic erasure of personality, the gilded isolation. I grabbed a dish towel and gripped it until my knuckles turned white. I was not going to intervene. I was saving myself. I had spent the last 3 weeks working the closing shift at a greasy diner 3 towns over, coming home smelling of stale fry oil and bleach, stashing cash in a hollowed-out dictionary under my bed. I was applying for transfer programs at universities 2,000 miles away. I walked into my bedroom, locked the door, and pulled the dictionary from its hiding spot. I counted the limp, grease-stained $20 bills. $800. It wasn't enough. Not nearly enough to outrun a billionaire, if he ever realized he married the wrong sister. I shoved the money back, my chest tight. I had to let her fall. It was her or me, and I had already died once. "You are wearing that." My mother's voice was a jagged knife scraping across a plate. I stood in the hallway, wearing a pair of plain black slacks and a loose, oversized beige sweater. I had tied my hair back into a severe, messy bun and scrubbed my face completely clean of makeup. I looked like a tired librarian. "It's just dinner, Mom," I said, keeping my voice flat, devoid of any challenge. "It is dinner at the Preston estate," my father snapped, adjusting a hideous paisley tie in the hall mirror. He reeked of cheap drugstore cologne and nervous sweat. "Arthur invited the whole family. It is a show of respect. You will not embarrass your sister." Sienna descended the stairs. She was wearing another of Arthur's gifts, a pale silver slip dress that clung to her ribs. She looked beautiful, but there were faint, dark smudges under her eyes. She hadn't been sleeping. Arthur had a habit of calling at 3 a.m. because his crash trauma gave him nightmares, and he demanded she stay on the line until sunrise. "Let her wear what she wants, Dad," Sienna said, her voice tight, a little brittle. She didn't look at me. Arthur doesn't care about Nora anyway. The drive to the estate was a masterclass in suffocating silence. The Preston property wasn't a home. It was a fortress, masked as a mansion. High, wrought-iron gates swung open to reveal a mile-long driveway, lined with skeletal oak trees. The tires crunched over perfectly raked gravel when the heavy oak front doors opened. The air inside hit me like a physical blow. It smelled of beeswax, lemon polish, and old money. The marble foyer was cavernous, echoing with the ticking of a massive grandfather clock. Arthur stood at the base of the grand staircase. Seeing him again, in the flesh, sent a wave of pure, visceral nausea roiling through my stomach. He leaned heavily on a black cane, his left leg still in a brace. The bruises on his face had faded to a sickly yellow, but his eyes were the same, ice blue, restless, and completely devoid of warmth. When he saw Sienna, those eyes locked onto her like a predator acquiring a target. He didn't smile. He just stared, a heavy, consuming gaze. "You came," he said. His voice was a low, aristocratic rasp. He didn't greet my parents. He completely ignored me. He reached out, grabbed Sienna's wrist, a little too hard, his knuckles white, and pulled her into his side. "Come, dinner is waiting." The dining room was a long, oppressive chamber with a mahogany table that could seat 30. Tonight, there were only 6 settings. Beatrice Preston sat at the head of the table, nursing a glass of red wine. She looked exactly as she had at the hospital, an ice sculpture of a woman, but it was the man sitting to her right who made the hair on my arms stand up. Colin Preston. He was older than Arthur by 5 years, but he possessed an easy, terrifying charm that his younger brother lacked. He had dark hair, a perfectly trimmed beard, and wore a relaxed cashmere sweater. He looked like a handsome, approachable catalog model. I knew he was a murderer. I knew that in less than 2 months, Arthur would discover Colin tampered with the car. I knew Colin's private helicopter would mysteriously go down in a ball of fire. "Ah, the saviors have arrived," Colin said, standing up. His smile was warm, but his eyes were entirely dead. He walked over and extended a hand to my father, who practically vibrated with pathetic excitement, shaking it vigorously. When Colin's gaze slid to Sienna, I saw the exact moment he calculated her worth. He looked at her the way a butcher looks at a lamb. He saw a weakness, a lever he could pull to break Arthur. Then his eyes flicked to me. I immediately slumped my shoulders, looked down at the carpet, and shuffled my feet, projecting pure, unadulterated insignificance. I made myself small, boring. "And the sister," Colin murmured, losing interest in me almost instantly. He turned back to Sienna. "You must be very brave, Sienna, dragging my brother from that river. We are deeply indebted to you." The pause before the word indebted was microscopic. Only someone looking for it would hear the mockery. Dinner was agonizing. The food, some kind of roasted quail with a blackberry reduction, tasted like ash in my mouth. I kept my head down, chewing mechanically, listening to the horrifying dynamic unfold. Arthur barely ate. He kept his left hand resting on the back of Sienna's neck. It looked like an affectionate gesture, but I knew the heavy, warm weight of his palm. It was a physical restraint. Every time Sienna tried to lean forward to engage in the conversation, his fingers would flex, subtly pulling her back against her chair. "Sienna is quite the artist, actually," my mother bragged, desperately trying to fill the heavy silence. "She paints beautiful landscapes." "Does she?" Beatrice asked mildly, not looking up from her plate. She took a microscopic bite of meat. "How quaint. We have several Monets in the gallery. Perhaps you can study them. God knows this house needs a feminine touch." Considering Arthur's tastes, I prefer her time to be entirely focused. Arthur interrupted, his voice cutting through the clinking of silver like a whip. The art can wait. She's busy. Sienna gave a small, nervous laugh. I mean, it's just a hobby. It's a distraction. Arthur corrected, turning his head to look at her. His face was inches from hers. You don't need distractions anymore. You have me. My stomach plummeted. The room went perfectly still. My parents sat there, completely oblivious to the massive red flag being waved in their faces, grinning like idiots because a billionaire was claiming their daughter. Colin watched the exchange with a detached, clinical amusement, sipping his wine. Sienna looked down at her lap. Her cheeks flushed deeply. Yes, Arthur. I gripped the stem of my water goblet so hard, I was surprised it didn't shatter in my hand. I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip the mahogany table, grab Sienna by her hair, and drag her out of this mausoleum. But then I remembered the hospital bed. I remembered coughing up blood while Arthur watched, his eyes flat, convinced I was making up my pain for attention. I remembered the sheer terror of dying completely alone in a room full of people. I took a slow sip of water. I let the cold liquid wash away the panic. You made your choice, Sienna, I thought, staring at my reflection in the polished silver knife beside my plate. You wanted the crown. Now wear it. Dessert, anyone? Colin asked, his voice cheerful, slicing through the heavy, toxic atmosphere. I didn't eat the dessert. I knew the pastry chef Beatrice employed. He liked to use almond extract to mask the bitter taste of crushed sedatives when Beatrice decided a guest was too hyperactive. I wasn't taking any chances. By the time we finally left, the cold night air outside felt like a physical reprieve. I practically ran to the SUV. As I climbed into the back seat, I glanced back at the front doors. Arthur was standing on the threshold, leaning on his cane. He was watching the car. He wasn't watching Sienna. For a terrifying, heart-stopping second, as the headlights swept across the porch, his eyes met mine through the tinted glass. A cold shiver violently racked my spine. I broke the gaze, sinking down into the leather seat, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. It was nothing, I told myself. A trick of the light. An accident. He didn't care about me. I was the invisible sister. But all the way home, I couldn't shake the sensation of crosshairs resting directly on the back of my neck. The proposal happened 2 weeks later. It wasn't a question. It was an ambush. Arthur didn't do intimacy. He did spectacles. He rented out the entire botanical gardens downtown, a massive, vaulted greenhouse filled with tropical flora that smelled of wet earth, rot, and heavy-blooming orchids. He filled it with a 50-piece orchestra, playing aggressively swelling classical music. I know, because my parents dragged me along under the guise of a family outing. Sienna walked into the greenhouse wearing a blindfold, led by Davis, the security guard. When she took it off, the orchestra swelled. Arthur was standing at the end of a path, paved with thousands of white rose petals, leaning heavily on his cane, holding a velvet box. I stood in the shadows near a massive fern, watching my sister crumble into tears. You saved my life, Arthur's voice boomed, echoing off the glass ceiling. He didn't kneel. He couldn't, because of his leg. But he didn't need to. The entire room was already bowing to him. You pulled me from the dark, Sienna. I cannot exist in the dark anymore. Be my light. Permanently. It was a beautiful, terrifying monologue. It sounded like a romantic vow, but I knew the translation. You are my property now. You belong in my vault. Sienna sobbed. She nodded frantically. She let him slide a diamond the size of a marble onto her left hand. The ring was so heavy, her finger physically dipped from the weight. My parents cheered. My father actually wept, no doubt calculating the sudden, massive inflation of his own net worth. I slipped out of the greenhouse before the champagne was uncorked. I took a city bus back to the suburbs. The air inside the bus smelled like damp wool and exhaust fumes. It was beautiful. It was real. I sat in the back, leaning my head against the vibrating glass, and pulled out my phone. I had an email. Admissions Office, University of Washington. Status: accepted. I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for 2 months. It was on the other side of the country. Seattle. It rained there all the time. I would be a face in a crowd of 40,000 students. I had enough cash saved from the diner to buy a one-way bus ticket and survive in a cheap hostel for a month until I found a job. I was getting out. When I finally walked into our house, it was dark and blissfully quiet. The smell of the rotting flowers from Arthur's first delivery still vaguely clung to the curtains, but it was fading. I went to my room, pulled out a duffel bag from the closet, and started packing. Only the essentials: jeans, heavy sweaters, a good pair of boots, no dresses, nothing that could be tied back to the life I was leaving behind. An hour later, the front door banged open. Laughter and loud, excited voices flooded the hallway. My bedroom door swung open without a knock. Sienna stood there. She was holding a bottle of absurdly expensive champagne by the neck. Her face was flushed, her makeup slightly smeared, the massive diamond catching the light from my cheap desk lamp and throwing jagged rainbows across my faded walls. "I'm engaged," she slurred, leaning heavily against the doorframe. "I saw," I said quietly, zipping my duffel bag and shoving it under my bed with my foot. "Congratulations, Sienna." She stared at me. For a long moment, the manic, victorious gleam in her eyes cracked. The alcohol was stripping away the protective lacquer she had been painting over her anxiety. She walked into my room and sat heavily on the edge of my mattress. It sagged under her weight. "He fired my boss today," she whispered. I froze, my hand hovering over my desk drawer. "What?" "I worked at the gallery, remember?" She looked down at her hands, tracing the band of the massive ring. "I told him yesterday that I had a big exhibition coming up, that I was stressed about hanging the pieces. Today, my boss called, said the gallery had been bought out, said all current staff were terminated with a massive severance package." She looked up at me. Her eyes were wet, but not with happy tears. There was a raw, naked panic swimming in them. "He did it so I wouldn't be stressed," she said, her voice shaking. He said I didn't need to work ever again, that my only job was to be his." The velvet trap had snapped shut, quicker than it had for me, perhaps because she was the one who pulled him from the wreck. His obsession with her was magnified. He was isolating her at light speed. "Sienna," I started, a sudden, heavy stone of guilt lodging in my throat. I could tell her. I could pack her a bag right now. We could both run. But then I remembered Colin Preston's dead eyes. If Sienna ran, Arthur's psychotic paranoia would detonate. He would hunt her down. He would hunt our family down. If I ran with her, I would just be chaining myself to a sinking ship. "He's just protecting you," I lied. My voice sounded hollow, like it belonged to someone else. "He loves you. You're going to be a billionaire's wife, Sienna. This is what you wanted. You don't have to worry about anything anymore." Sienna stared at me, searching my face for What? Sympathy? An escape hatch? She didn't find either. My face was a mask of polite envy. Slowly, the panic in her eyes receded, swallowed back down by the ego and the greed. She stood up, smoothing the front of her expensive dress. She lifted her chin. "You're right," she said, the slight slur returning. "I'm just overwhelmed. It's a lot. I'm going to have a staff, Nora. I'm going to have a house in the Hamptons. You're going to have it all." I agreed, softly. She smiled, a brittle, sharp thing, and walked out of my room, leaving the door open behind her. I sat there in the silence, listening to her stumble up the stairs. I reached under the bed, grabbed my duffel bag, and pulled it out. Step 2, I thought, the cold resolve hardening in my chest, freezing over the guilt. Disappear. I set my alarm for 4 a.m. My bus left at 6. I was going to be a ghost before Arthur Preston even woke up. Seattle rain is different from the storm that washed Arthur Preston's blood into the dirt. It doesn't howl. It just suffocates. A relentless, gray drizzle that coats the concrete in a slick sheen and seeps into the marrow of your bones. I loved it. It was the perfect weather to disappear into. My new life smelled like roasted espresso beans, damp canvas, and industrial bleach. I worked the opening shift at a gritty, independent coffee shop near the university campus, wiping down tables before the sun even bothered to try and penetrate the cloud cover. I rented a basement apartment that had no cell service and exactly one window that looked out onto a brick wall. It was a masterpiece of mediocrity. I had legally changed my last name to my mother's maiden name. I wore baggy flannels and kept my hair cropped short, hacking it off myself with kitchen shears over a chipped porcelain sink. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see a billionaire's tragic, poisoned wife. I saw a tired, 20-something student majoring in forensic accounting. I kept tabs on the Prestons, of course. You didn't just turn your back on a sleeping tiger. You watched its chest rise and fall from a very safe distance. The wedding made national news. Sienna looked like a porcelain doll wrapped in a straitjacket of spun sugar and diamonds. The magazines called it the fairy tale of the decade. I sat in a dingy laundromat, watching the broadcast on a muted, static-filled television, eating a lukewarm slice of dollar pizza. Arthur stood beside her at the altar, gripping his silver-handled cane, looking incredibly handsome and entirely hollow. He didn't kiss her when the priest finished. He just gripped her jaw and pressed his lips to her forehead, sealing a contract. 6 months later, the second shoe dropped. I was wiping the espresso machine when a news alert flashed on my phone, which was propped up next to the tip jar. Tragedy strikes the Preston family. Colin Preston, heir and executive, killed in private helicopter crash in the Cascades. I stopped wiping. The rag in my hand was soaking wet with scalding water, but I didn't feel the burn. The timeline was holding. The beast was operating exactly as I remembered. Colin had tried to kill Arthur. Arthur had found out. Arthur retaliated with absolute, psychotic disproportion. A dark, shameful thrill curled in my gut. I had survived. I had successfully navigated the minefield and left my sister holding the detonator. But the guilt was a stubborn parasite. It flared up late at night, usually when the radiator in my apartment hissed and clanked. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if Sienna was coughing up blood yet, wondering if Beatrice was slipping almond extract into her nightly tea. The answer came on a Tuesday in November, exactly a year and a half after I left. The coffee shop landline rang. It was an archaic beige plastic thing that only rang when our supplier was late. My manager, Greg, was in the back taking inventory. I wiped my hands on my apron and picked it up. Central Roasters. Static crackled on the other end. Thick, heavy static, like a desperate breath trying to push through a clogged filter. Nora. The name sounded like tearing paper. I froze. The ambient noise of the cafe, the hiss of the steam wand, the low murmur of college students studying, suddenly sounded like it was coming from underwater. Sienna, I breathed. He took my phone, Nora. Her voice was a frantic, ragged whisper. She was talking too fast, tripping over her words. He took my passport. Davis stands outside the bathroom when I shower. He says it's because the press is too aggressive. But they're not outside. Nobody is outside. The gates are always locked. My grip on the plastic receiver tightened until my knuckles ached. Where are you calling from? A gardener's phone. I stole it. Nora, I'm scared. Beatrice looks at me like she's waiting for me to die. And Arthur doesn't sleep. He just sits in the corner of the bedroom and watches me. He asks me questions about the crash. The same questions, over and over. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. He's testing her. In my past life, Arthur's trauma made him obsess over the details of his rescue. He wanted to know exactly how it felt, what the water smelled like, how heavy the door was. He treated the memory like a religious text. What kind of questions? I asked, my voice flat, betraying none of the absolute terror seizing my chest. He asks what the car smelled like. Sienna sobbed, the sound small and pathetic. I told him it smelled like mud. He got so angry, Nora. He threw a crystal decanter at the wall. He said I was lying. Why would he say that? Because a flooded engine block mixed with a cracked radiator doesn't smell like mud. It smells like sharp, sickeningly sweet antifreeze and burning electrical wire. I knew that. Arthur knew that. Sienna didn't. The velvet trap wasn't just closed. The spikes were beginning to deploy. Sienna, listen to me, I said, a cruel, pragmatic calmness settling over me. The same calmness that allowed me to watch her climb down into the ravine. You have to tell him you were in shock. Tell him your memory is fragmented from the trauma. Do not try to guess. I can't do this anymore, she wept. I want to come home. I want Mom. Mom and Dad's mortgage was paid off by Preston Shipping, I said brutally. They are driving leased Mercedes and attending country club dinners. They won't help you. If you leave, Arthur will take it all back, and they will resent you forever. So what do I do? She screamed into the phone. You survive, I whispered. You chose the crown, Sienna. You don't get to take it off just because it's heavy. I hung up the phone. I didn't just hang it up. I pulled the beige cord straight out of the wall jack with a sharp, violent yank. I stood there behind the counter, my chest heaving, the smell of roasted coffee suddenly nauseating. I had cut the line. I had abandoned her again. I told myself it was self-defense. I told myself she would have done the exact same thing to me. But as I looked at the frayed copper wires dangling from the wall, the taste of old pennies flooded the back of my throat. The paranoia took root that afternoon. I stopped taking the bus. I walked home in the driving rain, taking erratic, winding routes through alleys that smelled of stale beer and wet garbage. I checked the lock on my basement window 3 times every night. I thought I was being careful. I thought the Pacific Northwest was a big enough rug to sweep myself under. I was wildly, hilariously wrong. It happened on a Friday, 3 weeks after Sienna's phone call. I was walking out of my advanced auditing lecture, pulling the hood of my rain jacket up against the biting wind. The campus was emptying out, a sea of gray umbrellas navigating the concrete quad. A black SUV was idling at the curb. It wasn't a sleek, shiny Preston town car. It was a rugged, matte black utility vehicle with heavily tinted windows and reinforced steel bumpers. It looked like a military transport that had gotten lost in the suburbs. I didn't stop. I kept my head down, quickening my pace, merging into a group of laughing freshmen. A massive hand clamped down on my shoulder. It wasn't a tap, it was a vice grip that dug directly into my collarbone. The exact collarbone I had shattered in my past life, pulling Arthur out of the wreckage. A phantom ache flared violently in the bone. "Miss Nora," the voice was grinding stones. "Davis." I didn't scream. Screaming implies you think someone is coming to help you. I simply stopped, my blood turning to ice water. I slowly turned my head. Davis was wearing a heavy tactical jacket that smelled faintly of ozone and expensive gun oil. His flat, dead eyes scanned the crowds of students, completely unbothered by the public setting. To men like him, the public were just obstacles. "Get your hand off me," I said. My voice was surprisingly steady. Davis released my shoulder, stepping back half a pace, giving me the illusion of space. "Mr. Preston requests your presence." "I don't know a Mr. Preston." Davis didn't blink. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick, manila envelope. He held it out to me. The rain immediately began to pit the brown paper. "He requests your presence," Davis repeated. "In the vehicle." I looked at the envelope. I looked at the dark, tinted windows of the SUV. The engine gave a low, throaty rumble. Arthur was in there. The devil had crossed the country. I snatched the envelope from Davis's hand and tore the top open. Inside was a stack of glossy 8x10 photographs. I shuffled through them, the rain smearing the ink. The first was a picture of my basement apartment. The second was a picture of me, taken through the window of the coffee shop. The third was a medical file. It was a toxicology report. The name at the top was Sienna Preston. The chemical highlighted in bright, searing yellow marker was a heavy metal. Beatrice was poisoning her. My breath caught in my throat. I looked up at Davis, my carefully constructed walls cracking. "Is she dead?" "Not yet," Davis said impassively. "The vehicle, Miss Nora. I had nowhere to run. If I bolted, Davis would tackle me to the concrete before I made it 10 yards. And even if I got away, they had my address. They had my life." I walked to the SUV. Davis opened the rear door. The interior smelled of rich leather, expensive scotch, and the unmistakable sterile scent of rubbing alcohol. Arthur sat in the far corner, his bad leg stretched out stiffly across the seat. He looked atrocious. His tailored suit hung loosely on his frame, as if he had lost 15 pounds in a month. Dark, bruise-like circles hung under his eyes. He looked like a man being consumed from the inside out. When his eyes met mine, the temperature in the car plummeted. There was no affection. There was no gratitude. There was only a terrifying, ravenous clarity. I climbed in. The heavy door slammed shut behind me with a sickening thud, cutting off the sound of the rain. "Hello, Nora," Arthur rasped. He swirled a finger of amber liquid in a crystal glass. "You cut your hair." I pressed myself against the opposite door, putting as much leather between us as possible. "Why are you here, Arthur?" He didn't answer immediately. He took a slow sip of his scotch. "My wife is currently in a private clinic in upstate New York. She collapsed 3 days ago at a charity gala. A complete renal failure." I stared at him, gripping the wet manila envelope. "Your mother is poisoning her." Arthur smiled, a terrifying, razor-thin line that didn't reach his eyes. "Yes, Beatrice does dislike competition, but that is an internal family matter. What interests me, Nora, is the delirious confession my wife made while the paramedics were trying to stabilize her heart rate. My stomach bottomed out. We were in free fall. She was terrified of dying. Arthur continued, his voice dropping to a low, hypnotic register. People in terror tend to shed their lies. She begged me to forgive her. She told me she didn't want the money anymore. She told me she never even touched the water that night. He leaned forward. The air in the car seemed to thin out, making it hard to breathe. She told me, Arthur whispered, his blue eyes boring into my skull, that you stood on the ridge, watched me drowning, and told her to claim the rescue. I didn't deny it. I didn't burst into tears. I looked at the man who had ordered my life support cut off in another timeline, and I felt a sudden, massive surge of adrenaline. The fear evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard defiance. She's telling the truth, I said evenly. I watched you bleed. I let her take the credit. Arthur's hand trembled. The ice in his glass clinked violently. For a second, I thought he was going to strike me. The betrayal on his face was absolute. He had built a religion around a savior, and the savior was a fraud. Why? He demanded, his voice cracking, shedding the aristocratic veneer. You could have had everything. I gave her the world. I gave her an empire. That was meant for you. I didn't want your empire, Arthur. I spat, leaning forward, matching his intensity. Your empire is a graveyard. Your brother tried to murder you. Your mother is murdering your wife. Your wealth is built on paranoia and blood. I gave Sienna to you because I knew you would destroy whoever you loved, and I refused to let it be me. The silence in the SUV was absolute. Only the drumming of the rain on the roof broke the tension. Arthur stared at me. He looked at the harsh cut of my cheap hair, my wet flannel jacket, my eyes that held absolutely no reverence for him. And then, horrifyingly, the anger drained out of his face. The obsession didn't die. It simply mutated. You saw the rot, he murmured, almost to himself. A strange, twisted awe crept into his voice. Sienna just saw the gold, but you saw the entire board. You sacrificed your own flesh and blood to outmaneuver us. He set his glass down. He reached out and grabbed my wrist. His skin was feverishly hot. You are exactly what I need. Arthur breathed, his grip tightening like a tourniquet. A partner who sees the knife before it falls. Come back with me, Nora. We will bury Beatrice together. We will fix it. I looked at his hand wrapped around my wrist. It was the same grip that had once forced a diamond ring onto my finger. It was the same trap, just a different bait. No, I said. I didn't pull away. I let him hold my wrist. I let him feel my pulse, which was perfectly, unnervingly steady. You think you have leverage here, Arthur? I asked softly. You think you can drag me back to your mausoleum because you discovered Sienna is a liar? I don't need leverage, Arthur said, his eyes glittering with that familiar, psychotic certainty. I have resources you cannot comprehend. You have nowhere to run, Nora. Your life in Seattle is over. My life here was over the second Davis touched my shoulder, I agreed. But you are deeply mistaken about who holds the cards. With my free hand, I reached into the damp pocket of my jeans. I pulled out a small, silver object. A standard, cheap, USB drive. I tossed it onto the leather console between us. It landed with a quiet clack. Arthur glanced at it, frowning. What is that? Forensic accounting is a fascinating major, I said, leaning back into the seat, finally pulling my wrist out of his loosened grip. You learn how to track money. You learn how to look for inconsistencies. In my spare time, I decided to run some basic algorithmic searches on the public filings of Preston Shipping. That was a lie. I didn't find the information through school. I knew it from the 3 years I spent trapped in his estate, listening at keyholes, reading documents left on his mahogany desk while he slept. You're bluffing, Arthur sneered, though a tiny flicker of doubt crossed his face. There's an offshore shell company registered in the Cayman Islands called Aegis Holdings, I recited, keeping my voice painfully bored. It's managed by a proxy firm your mother, Beatrice, retains. 2 weeks before your accident, a wire transfer of $500,000 moved from Aegis to an untraceable account in Macau. The exact same day, a mechanic at your private garage quietly retired and moved to a non-extradition country. Arthur stopped breathing. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of dirty snow. Colin didn't cut your brakes, Arthur, I said, watching the realization shatter him like glass. Colin was an arrogant idiot who wanted your job, but he wasn't a killer. He was just a convenient scapegoat. Beatrice ordered the hit. You're lying, he whispered. His hands began to shake violently. Why would she do that? I asked rhetorically, ignoring his denial. Because you were starting to look into the pension funds. You were asking questions about the massive, bleeding holes in the company's ledger. Beatrice has been embezzling from the Preston Empire for a decade to fund her private art acquisitions and her gambling debts. You were going to expose her. So, she tried to put you in a ravine. I pointed to the USB drive. The routing numbers, the proxy signatures, the hidden ledgers, it's all on there. A digital breadcrumb trail leading right to your mother's throat. Arthur stared at the silver drive, as if it were a live grenade. His mind, already fractured by trauma and betrayal, was visibly buckling under the weight of the truth. His entire crusade against his brother, the murder he orchestrated in retaliation, was built on a lie manufactured by his own mother. If I don't check in with a specific email server in exactly 4 hours, I lied smoothly, securing the lock on his cage, the contents of that drive will automatically forward to the SEC, the FBI, and the investigative journalism desk of the New York Times. The Preston Empire will be dismantled in a month. Beatrice will go to federal prison, and you, Arthur, will be dragged down in the crossfire. He looked up at me. The arrogant, consuming predator was gone. Sitting across from me was a broken, terrified little boy who realized the monsters were in his own house. What do you want? He choked out. I want you to tell Davis to open the door, I said. I want you to drive to the airport and go back to your miserable, rotting kingdom. You are going to clean house. You are going to deal with Beatrice. And you are going to leave Sienna exactly where she is. Pay for her clinic. Give her an allowance. Let her live in her gilded cage. But you will never, ever look for me again. Arthur swallowed hard. He reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the USB drive. He gripped it so tightly, his knuckles turned white. You are ruthless, he whispered. I learned from the best, I replied. I reached out and popped the lock on the heavy door. I pushed it open. The freezing Seattle rain immediately lashed across my face. It tasted like ozone, wet pavement, and absolute, unconditional freedom. I stepped out of the SUV and slammed the door shut without looking back. I didn't run. I walked down the sidewalk, blending into the sea of gray umbrellas. Behind me, the heavy engine of the armored vehicle roared to life. Tires hissed against the wet asphalt as Arthur Preston turned around and headed back toward the airport, driving straight into the hell of his own making. I walked until my boots were soaked through. I walked until I found a cheap diner that smelled of stale fry oil and bad coffee. I sat in a booth near the window, ordered a black coffee, and watched the rain wash the city clean. The nightmare was finally over. I had left the devil in the mud, right where he belonged. That's the end of Nora's ruthless game. If you felt the cold grip of that rain and loved watching a protagonist outsmart the billionaire, instead of bowing to him, hit that like button right now. It really helps push the story out. Share this with someone who loves dark, strategic drama and characters who don't apologize for their survival. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new story. I want to hear from you in the comments. Was Nora a villain, a survivor, or both? See you in the next one.